There is a version of World War I that most people carry with them. It lives in sepia photographs. Soldiers standing in rows before departure, their faces still holding the expression of men who believed they were going somewhere. Poppies on lapels each November, names carved into stone, monuments tall enough to remind without explaining. That version of the war is clean. It has borders. It begins in 1914 and ends in 1918, and it means something. It was supposed to mean something. The men who organized it said it meant something. The newspapers said it. The recruiting posters said it. The chaplains said it over open graves in fields so churned by artillery that the graves themselves rarely stayed closed. That version of the war is a lie. Not a dramatic lie. Not a conspiracy. Something quieter and more durable than that. It is the lie of omission. The lie of what was recorded and what was quietly set aside. What was written in official dispatches and what was written in diaries by men who knew their letters home were being read by censors before they reached their families. The real war did not happen in the dispatches. It happened in the margins, in field notebooks soaked with rain, in medical logs that tracked conditions without names because the names would have caused problems, in the letters that were never sent and the ones that were sent but arrived with lines blacked out by men in offices far from the trenches who had decided certain truths were inconvenient. This is about those truths, not the war as it was sold. The war as it was lived, the habits that formed in the mud, the behaviors that soldiers developed and kept secret or half secret or stopped bothering to hide because there was no one left who would have cared. These are the things that surface in war diaries, in regimental histories buried in national archives, in the unpublished memoirs of medical officers, in the letters of nurses who saw what came back from the front lines and understood that what they were looking at had no clean name. 19 habits, 19 documented realities that the official record chose not to emphasize, not invented, not dramatized, drawn from the primary sources that the romantic version of the war has always quietly avoided. The first thing to understand is the smell. It sounds like a small detail. It is not a small detail. Every soldier who kept a diary in the First World War at some point wrote about smell, not as a literary gesture, as a fact of survival. The trenches of the Western Front were not simply ditches, they were systems. Networks extending hundreds of miles through France and Belgium, some sections held by the same units for months at a time, some never properly drained, some built over or beside the bodies of men killed in earlier phases of the war who were never recovered because recovering them was operationally impossible, or because their location made retrieval too costly in additional lives. The smell of those trenches was something that men described in their diaries with a kind of compulsive precision, as if naming it carefully enough might make it manageable. It was not manageable. It was the smell of decomposition at varying stages, of human waste from latrines that were often flooded or compromised, of wet wool that never fully dried, of cordite and sulfur from constant shell fire, of chloride of lime used to disinfect areas where disease had already taken hold, and underneath all of it, always, the smell of mud that had absorbed years of organic material and gave off its own particular odor that veterans would describe decades later as something they could never entirely forget. Men in those trenches developed a habit of breathing through their mouths. Not consciously at first, it became automatic. Medical officers noted that soldiers who had spent extended time in the forward trenches would often breathe differently upon return to rear areas, the mouth breathing persisting as a learned response long after the smell itself was gone. It was a small mechanical adaptation, the body adjusting, the first of many. The bodies did not go away. That is the thing that official histories managed to discuss without ever fully conveying. On the Western Front, the geography of battle was fixed in a way that no previous industrial war had prepared anyone for. The front lines moved in some sectors by hundreds of yards over the course of years. The area between opposing trenches, the ground called no man's land, became over time a kind of preserved record of every assault that had crossed it. Men killed in attacks in 1914 were still there in 1916, not as skeletons. The conditions of the front, the constant disturbance of the soil by shell fire, the intermittent flooding, the presence of rats and other scavengers, meant that the state of human remains in no man's land existed along a spectrum that soldiers had to learn to process as a normal feature of their environment. The habit that formed around this was documentation combined with deliberate dissociation. Soldiers began keeping notes about the dead, not as an act of grief, but as a form of spatial orientation. Diaries from multiple national armies record soldiers using the positions of bodies as landmarks. Turn left at the sergeant. The notation might read, "The large shell hole past the 3 from last October." This was not callousness in the conventional sense, it was adaptation. The mind finding a way to continue functioning in an environment that should not have been sustainable. Medical officers who later analyzed trench diaries noted that this spatial mapping of the dead served a psychological function. It gave the random carnage a kind of structure. It made the unburied men into something useful. It was the mind doing what minds do under sustained impossible pressure. It found a way through. The rats are mentioned in nearly every sustained account of trench life, and the habit that developed around them is one of the most documented and least discussed aspects of the war's psychological texture. By the middle period of the war, trench rats on the Western Front had grown to sizes that soldiers found genuinely alarming. The combination of abundant food and relative safety from predators had allowed rat populations to reach densities that contemporary observers described in terms that sound exaggerated, but align with what zoologists would later confirm was biologically plausible. The rats fed on what the trenches provided. They were not subtle about it. Soldiers writing in diaries describe waking to find rats on their person, in their equipment, consuming rations that had been poorly secured. The habit that emerged was not primarily about exterminating the rats, though soldiers did attempt that with varying and generally unsatisfying results. The habit was a kind of negotiated coexistence combined with a specific form of violence that became ritualized. Units developed their own approaches. Some men kept terriers if they could obtain them. Some set elaborate traps. But the more widespread habit was the organized rat hunt, conducted during periods of relative quiet, usually at night, using entrenching tools and bayonets, conducted with a focused collective energy that officers noted seemed to serve a function well beyond pest control. The violence directed at the rats was intense, systematic and enthusiastic in ways that made some observers uncomfortable. It was one of the few forms of violence in the trenches that the soldier could control, could direct, could complete. Most of the violence of that war had no satisfying arc. The artillery came from somewhere unseen. The gas drifted on wind that did not consult anyone. The machine guns swept areas without discriminating. But the rat you could chase. The rat you could kill. The rat you could hold up afterward. And men did hold them up. The diaries record this. Men proudly displaying large rats they had killed, treating the hunt as a genuine achievement, a competition with scores. Several regimental diaries from British units record formal rat-killing competitions with tallies kept and prizes awarded. This was not a joke. It was a psychological pressure valve disguised as a game. The relationship with personal hygiene underwent a transformation in the trenches that the home front was never fully informed about. Recruitment posters and newspaper coverage consistently presented British, French, and Allied soldiers as clean, disciplined, well-presented men. The reality of the trenches made sustained personal cleanliness functionally impossible for extended periods. Soldiers in forward positions might go weeks without the ability to properly wash. The water in the trenches was contaminated. The opportunity to remove clothing for cleaning was rare, and when it came was often interrupted by artillery or stand-to orders. The result was that men lived inside their clothing, in conditions that produced, in the words of one medical officer's diary, a secondary ecology on the human body. The habit that emerged was a specific and highly organized approach to the management of lice. Body lice, Pediculus, humanus, corporis, were universal in the trenches of the First World War. Every soldier had them. Every account mentions them. What the accounts describe, and what subsequent analysis of those accounts has confirmed, is that soldiers developed an entire ritualized set of behaviors around lice management that occupied significant portions of whatever downtime they had. The process, called chatting, derived from the British slang term for lice, involved removing one's clothing and systematically going through the seams, where lice and their eggs clustered, and crushing them one by one. This was done individually and collectively, often in groups, often during the brief rest periods that trench routine provided, and it acquired the social texture of a shared activity, something men did together, talking while they did it, or sitting in companionable silence. Medical officers who observed this noted that the social dimension of chatting served a function similar to grooming behaviors observed in other social animals. It was contact. It was shared purpose. It was something to do with the hands during hours when there was nothing else to do and too much time to think. The lice themselves caused real medical problems, being vectors for trench fever, a debilitating illness caused by Bartonella quintana that sent significant numbers of men to field hospitals, and that was not properly understood for much of the war. But the habit of managing them, the ritual of it, the social dimensions of it, became something else entirely. One of the small organizing rituals that gave shape to days that otherwise had very little shape. Sleep became something that no longer followed normal rules. The rhythm of trench life was organized around the stand-to at dawn and dusk, the moments of maximum tactical vulnerability when all men were required to be at the fire step, weapons ready, watching the ground in front. Between those two stand-tos, the day had a structure. But it was a structure built around constant low-level danger and interrupted by the random application of artillery, by working parties, by ration runs, by repair of trench walls damaged by rain or shells. Men in the forward trenches could rarely sleep more than a few hours at a stretch. They slept in dugouts that were frequently wet, often shared, never quiet in any absolute sense because the front line never went entirely silent, the artillery of one army or another always present somewhere along the horizon, the crack and rumble of it forming a constant auditory background that became, after long enough exposure, more disturbing by its absence than by its presence. The habit that formed around sleep in the trenches was the ability to sleep anywhere, in any position, under almost any conditions, except complete silence. Soldiers developed the capacity to fall into deep sleep while sitting, while standing in a fire bay, while being moved in a transport vehicle. This was noted by officers as both an asset and a concern. The asset was obvious. Men who could sleep when the opportunity arose were more functional. The concern was that the sleep they obtained this way was not restorative in the normal sense. Medical officers who kept careful records, and some did, noted that men who had been at the front for extended periods showed signs of cumulative sleep deprivation that persisted even during rest periods behind the lines, when conditions were objectively better. The body had recalibrated. It had learned a new normal. And that new normal included a form of sleep that was always partial, always listening, never the kind of sleep that meant safety. There was the matter of the dead that belonged to you, the men in your section, the men whose names you knew. On the Western Front, unlike in some previous wars, units were often composed of men from the same geographic areas, the PALS battalions of the British Army being the most documented example, communities that had enlisted together, trained together, and arrived at the front together. This meant that casualties were not strangers. They were neighbors, men whose families you knew, men who had worked in the same factory or attended the same church. When those men died, and they died in large numbers, the habit that formed around their deaths was not grief in any conventional sense, because conventional grief was operationally impossible. You could not stop. You could not mourn in any sustained way. The next hour still needed to happen. The next stand-to was still coming. What soldiers developed instead was a specific and carefully bounded form of acknowledgement combined with almost immediate practical processing. Diaries record this with a directness that is startling if you are not prepared for it. The notation of a death in a soldier's diary is often followed within the same entry by an inventory of the dead man's possessions and who received what. This was not theft. It was necessity. A man's boots might be the only pair of adequate size within reach. His spare socks were needed. His chocolate ration was already paid for, already there, and the man who had eaten with him the day before was still hungry. The immediate redistribution of a dead man's useful possessions was universal and entirely undocumented in official histories because it existed in a moral category that the home front was not equipped to process. It was not callousness, it was the metabolism of survival, but it created a habit of assessment that extended to the living as well. Men in the trenches became accustomed to evaluating the material reality of every person around them, what they carried, what they wore, what they would leave behind. It was not something that could easily be set aside when the war was over. The relationship with food was one of the most extensively documented aspects of trench life, and the habits it produced were among the most durable. The British Army's ration system was, by the standards of contemporary armies, reasonably well organized. Men in the trenches received regular rations of bully beef, biscuits, tea, and supplementary items when supply lines permitted. The problem was not primarily quantity, though quantity was sometimes an issue during sustained operations. The problem was the conditions under which food was prepared and consumed. Rations came up to the forward trenches at night, carried by ration parties who moved through communication trenches under fire, and by the time they arrived, they were often cold, sometimes contaminated by the conditions of transport, occasionally supplemented with whatever men had foraged from the abandoned farms and villages behind the lines. The habit that formed was a complete restructuring of the relationship between food and pleasure. Men in the trenches ate with a focused mechanical efficiency that observers from the home front found disturbing when they witnessed it. Food was fuel. It was warmth. It was one of the reliable physical pleasures in an environment where physical pleasure was systematically eliminated. The rituals around tea preparation became elaborate and important out of all proportion to what they produced. Men went to significant effort and accepted real risk to obtain hot tea, the brewing of it in tin cans over small fires that had to be kept small enough not to draw fire, requiring a specific set of skills and judgments that became second nature. The acquisition of supplementary food, foraging from shell-damaged orchards, trading with local farmers when rear positions allowed, stealing from other units' ration dumps, became a serious occupation and a source of genuine status. Men who were skilled foragers were valued in ways that the official structure of rank did not capture. But the deeper habit was the loss of any casual relationship with food as a sensory experience. Soldiers who served extended periods in the trenches and then received home leave reported consistently that eating at home was a disorienting experience. The food tasted wrong, not because the food had changed, but because their relationship to eating had changed. They ate too fast. They cleaned plates in ways that embarrassed their families. They saved food automatically, pocketing items they did not need immediately against a future shortage that was not going to happen. They had no category for eating that was relaxed, social, unhurried. The body had learned a different grammar around food, and the learning was not easily undone. Alcohol was officially regulated and officially distributed in the British Army in the form of the rum ration, issued during particularly cold or difficult periods at the discretion of commanding officers. Unofficially, alcohol occupied a much larger space in trench life than any official account acknowledges. The supply of alcohol from unofficial sources, purchased from estaminets in rear villages, traded for, obtained through channels that no one examined too carefully, was a consistent feature of life behind the front lines, and to a lesser degree in the forward trenches themselves. Officers had more access than men, their ability to purchase freely in rear areas giving them options that enlisted soldiers did not have, and this difference in access was noted and resented in ways that appear in enlisted diaries with a frequency and specificity that the official record does not reflect. The habit that formed around alcohol was not primarily about drunkenness, though drunkenness occurred and was managed by military justice in ways that were inconsistent and frequently class-determined. The habit was about the management of the period before an attack. The rum ration issued before going over the top has become one of the clichés of the Western Front, documented enough that even popular histories mention it. What those histories do not fully convey is the specific psychology of what was happening in those moments. Men receiving their rum ration before an assault were not being given a reward. They were being chemically adjusted for what was about to be required of them. The men who issued the ration knew this. The men who received it knew this. The transaction had a specific meaning that everyone present understood and that no one stated. The alcohol was a tool. And the habit it produced was an understanding of what alcohol was actually for. Not pleasure, not celebration, but the management of fear to the precise degree necessary for forward movement. There were the letters that went home and the letters that did not. Every soldier on the Western Front who could write, wrote letters. The volume of correspondence generated by the British Army alone during the First World War was so large that an entirely new postal infrastructure had to be created to handle it. And every piece of that correspondence passed through the hands of censors, officers whose job it was to read the letters written by the men under their command and remove any content that might provide useful information to the enemy, or, equally important to the military administration, any content that might cause problems on the home front. The habit that formed was a specific kind of double writing. Soldiers learned very quickly what could be said and what could not. They learned the phrases that passed without difficulty, the assurances of adequate food and reasonable conditions, the descriptions of training activities and camaraderie, the references to unnamed landscapes and unnamed operations. And they developed simultaneously a private language for the things that could not be said, a language that existed in the spaces between the sanctioned content. A soldier writing to his mother that the weather had been difficult was often encoding something else. The phrase "doing our bit" had a tone when written by someone who had been in the trenches long enough that it communicated something different from what the censors were paid to notice. Men became skilled at this. They became skilled at conveying reality through tone, through what was conspicuously absent, through references that would mean one thing to the censor and something entirely different to the person who knew them. The corollary habit was that men stopped expecting honesty in the letters they received. Homefront letters were also performing confidence, performing normalcy, hiding the fear and the grief and the economic difficulties that the war had imposed on families. So, the correspondence of the First World War was an exchange of coordinated fictions maintained by mutual tacit agreement, each side protecting the other from truths that neither could do anything about. This habit of managed communication, of speaking in layers, of saying the permissible thing while meaning something else, became so ingrained that soldiers coming home on leave frequently found direct communication with their families impossible, not because they did not want to tell the truth, but because they had spent so long not telling it that the machinery for telling it had stopped working. The landscape of the Western Front was one of the most extensively modified environments in human history up to that point. The shelling alone, the millions of artillery rounds fired into a relatively narrow strip of territory over 4 years, fundamentally altered the physical structure of the land. Entire villages disappeared. Forests were reduced to fields of wooden stumps. Rivers changed course. The topsoil of large areas was displaced to depths that agricultural recovery would take generations to address. And beneath all of this, the bodies, the estimates of soldiers whose remains were never recovered from the Western Front, who are still there, under the fields of France and Belgium, run to hundreds of thousands. The Thiepval Memorial in France, which commemorates British and South African soldiers killed on the Somme who have no known grave, bears over 72,000 names. The habit that soldiers developed in relation to this landscape was a specific form of environmental reading that had no precedent and no name. Men who lived in the trenches learned to read the ground the way their grandfathers had read weather. The pattern of shell holes indicated the caliber and direction of fire. The state of the mud in different sections indicated drainage, and therefore the presence or absence of bodies beneath it. The behavior of rats in a specific area told you things about what was in the ground there. The smell of particular stretches of trench told you things that no map recorded. Men became expert in a landscape that was entirely the product of industrialized destruction, and the expertise they developed was useless for anything except surviving in exactly that landscape. It transferred nowhere. It connected to nothing outside the war. It was knowledge that had been purchased at enormous cost and that would expire the moment the war ended, assuming the man who held it survived to see that moment. The bodies beneath the landscape were a fact that military administration handled with a bureaucratic efficiency that was itself a kind of habit. The graves registration units of the British Army were tasked with locating, identifying, and recording the dead. The scale of their work was such that it could only be managed by treating it as a logistical problem, which is what it was, but which was also something else entirely. The men who did this work kept records. Those records exist. They are precise and impersonal in the way that records have to be when the volume of what they are recording exceeds the human capacity to process each item as a unique event. Name, rank, regiment, location, condition of remains, presence or absence of identifying materials. Condition of remains was a category that appears in those records with a specificity that makes clear exactly what the graves registration units were encountering and dealing with on a daily basis as a matter of professional routine. The habit that formed in those units was a very specific and heavily documented form of professional detachment that the men who performed that work often described in their own diaries as necessary, as something they had deliberately constructed in order to continue doing the job. One medical officer attached to a graves registration unit wrote in his diary that he had learned to see what he was looking at without seeing it, a phrase that captures with some precision the psychological mechanism being described. You processed the information, you recorded it, you moved on to the next. The category of human remains had been functionally separated from the category of human being. This was not permanent. It was not comfortable. Several such diaries record the moments when the separation failed, when the mechanism broke down, and what that looked like when it did. But the construction and maintenance of that separation was the habit. It was the tool that allowed the work to continue. There was an entire economy of the dead that no official history discusses with any directness. When a soldier died in the trenches, he left behind equipment, clothing, personal possessions, and the paperwork that the army had generated about him. The equipment and clothing were, as already noted, practically redistributed. The personal possessions were supposed to be collected and sent home, and often were, processed through a system that was reasonably diligent given the scale of what it was handling. But the paperwork was something else. The paperwork of the dead generated its own bureaucratic momentum. Pay records continued for periods after death. Ration allocations sometimes remained on unit strength returns for men who had been dead for weeks if the administrative chain had not kept pace with the physical reality. This was not systematic fraud. It was the lag between the rate of death and the rate of the paperwork that tracked death, and it created situations in which men who no longer existed were still, on paper, present and accounted for. The soldiers who operated within this system developed a habit of understanding that the Army's administrative record of reality and the actual reality were not identical and might diverge significantly. This was not a cynical or subversive understanding. It was operational. You knew that what the roster said and what was actually standing in the trench might be different. You accounted for that difference in your calculations. You learned to navigate a system in which the paper version of things and the real version of things existed in parallel and required separate management. This, too, was a habit that transferred badly to civilian life, where the expectation was that the paper version and the real version were, if not identical, at least closely related. The medical system of the First World War was one of the most elaborately documented of any aspect of the war, and it generated its own set of habits that the official record has spent a century selectively presenting. The medical advances of the war were real. The development of new surgical techniques, the understanding of infection, the creation of blood transfusion systems, the development of reconstructive surgery for facial injuries. All of these were genuine achievements made under terrible pressure by people who worked very hard and saved lives that would otherwise have been lost. The official medical history of the war emphasizes these achievements. What the official history is less thorough about is the category of wounds and conditions that the medical system encountered and did not have solutions for. The psychological wounds, the conditions that were called, variously, shell shock and neurasthenia and nervous exhaustion, and a dozen other names that were all attempting to describe the same thing from different angles without fully committing to a description that would have had clinical and legal implications. The habit that formed in the medical system around these conditions was a habit of categorization designed to avoid outcomes that were administratively or politically inconvenient. A soldier who could not function because of what he had witnessed and survived was a problem. He was a problem for his unit, which needed him. He was a problem for the army, which had invested resources in him. He was a problem for the government, which could not afford to acknowledge that the war it was fighting was producing this kind of damage at scale. The response to that problem was a categorization system that sorted men into those whose symptoms could be attributed to physical cause and those whose symptoms could not, and treated the second category with a combination of rest, various physical interventions that ranged from the reasonable to the genuinely harmful, and an underlying institutional pressure to return to duty as quickly as possible. The men who sorted other men into these categories, the medical officers and the specialists and the boards that made final determinations, developed a habit of reading the space between what a man said and what his body showed, and making determinations that were influenced by factors that had nothing to do with medicine. How long the war needed to last, how many men the army needed, what the newspapers had been saying about cowardice and duty. Shell shock itself became, by the middle of the war, a diagnosis that was officially discouraged because it implied that the shell, the artillery, the mechanical violence of the war had caused the damage. That implied that the damage was real, that it was physical in origin, that it was not a failure of character. Military authorities were deeply uncomfortable with this implication. The habit in the medical system became a pressure toward diagnoses that located the problem in the individual rather than the environment, that treated the symptoms as something to be corrected rather than something to be understood, and that measured success by return to duty rather than by actual recovery. The records of casualty clearing stations and base hospitals document this pressure in the gap between what medical officers wrote in their private notes and what they wrote on official forms. The executions. The official record acknowledges them. In the British Army alone, 306 men were executed during the First World War, shot by firing squads composed of their own comrades for offences that included desertion, cowardice, quitting post, and other military crimes. The French army executed a larger number. The records of these executions are preserved. The habit that formed around them was not primarily among the men who were executed, but among the men who were required to carry them out. Being assigned to a firing squad was not voluntary. It was an order. Men who served on firing squads wrote about the experience in their diaries with a frequency and specificity that makes clear it was not something that passed without psychological consequence. The procedure was specific and military in its organization. The condemned man was brought out. He was secured. A medical officer was present. The firing squad, usually composed of 12 men, several of whose rifles were loaded with blank cartridges, so that no individual could know with certainty that he had fired a killing round, took position. An officer gave the command. The institution of the blank cartridges was a psychological accommodation. It was an acknowledgement that the act being required was one that the men being required to perform it could not easily integrate into their sense of themselves, and that giving some of them a way to not know for certain whether they had killed was useful. But the men who participated in these executions knew what had happened. The diary entries describing these events are sometimes clinical and sometimes not. One entry, from a British infantryman, describes returning to his section after serving on such a squad and being unable to speak for the remainder of the day, just sitting, and then notes that the next morning he was at stand to same as usual, and the entry moves on, the same as usual. That phrase appears in various forms across thousands of trench diaries. It is the most common linguistic marker in the entire genre. Something terrible happens. Something that by any civilian standard of measurement should require extended processing, extended response, should interrupt the ordinary flow of things. And then the next line returns to the ordinary flow of things, because the ordinary flow of things did not stop. The artillery did not care. The roster still needed to be kept. The same as usual was not numbness, though observers from outside the system sometimes interpreted it that way. It was a habit of continuity, a practiced refusal to let the terrible thing expand to fill the time it might otherwise claim. Because if it expanded, if you gave it the space it deserved, you would be unable to function, and the inability to function had its own consequences. The geography of the rear areas, the villages and towns behind the front lines, was organized in ways that reveal a great deal about what the military administration understood about what it was doing to the men it was sending forward. Base towns had establishments that the army officially did not sanction and practically did not interfere with. The areas around Amiens, around Rouen, around the various British General Headquarters locations contained concentrations of prostitution that the medical authorities tracked with some care because the venereal disease rates they produced were operationally significant. The French army managed this through a system of officially regulated establishments. The British Army's official position was that such establishments should not exist and that the army did not condone them, while its practical position was substantially different. The habit that formed in the rear areas around leave and rest periods was a compressed and intensified version of the desires that the forward trenches systematically suppressed. Men who had been in the front lines for extended periods and who received leave in rear areas or in England were described by observers as disoriented in ways that went beyond simple adjustment to changed conditions. There was something about the normality of rear life, the presence of women who were not nurses, the presence of food that was prepared rather than distributed, the presence of alcohol without the specific gravity of what it was being used for at the front, that produced a quality of experience that soldiers in their diaries often describe as unreal. The real thing was the trench. The leave was the dream. The habit of understanding civilian comfort as something temporary and fundamentally illusory was not something that resolved when the war ended. The officers and the enlisted men lived in the same war and did not live in the same war. The separation was formal, social, and physical. Officers ate separately. Officers slept separately in dugouts that were not always better, but were always different. Officers had access to resources that enlisted men did not have. Officers wrote letters under different censorship conditions, and the relationship between officers and the men they commanded was the subject of more diary entries from both sides than almost any other single aspect of trench life. What emerges from those diary entries is a picture considerably more complicated than the official narrative of mutual respect and shared purpose that the military histories have emphasized. There were officers whom the men trusted and would follow. There were officers whom the men considered incompetent, indifferent, or cowardly, and those judgments appear in enlisted diaries with a directness that reflects the stakes involved. When an officer's decisions were poor, men died. The men who survived knew why they had died and kept track of the officers responsible, not in any formal way, not in any way that the military justice system was designed to capture, but in the private accounting kept in diaries and in the collective memory of units that persisted in the form of reputation. The habit of the enlisted man toward his officers was therefore a habit of evaluation carried out under conditions where honest evaluation of your superiors was officially dangerous and practically essential. You needed to know whether the man who was going to give you orders that could kill you knew what he was doing. You needed to know whether he would spend your life casually or carefully. This evaluation was constant. It was shared. It was communicated through the specific language of men who knew they were being monitored, and it produced a form of institutional knowledge that existed entirely outside the official record, and that shaped unit behavior in ways that commanders at higher levels were not always aware of. There is the matter of what was collected. Soldiers in the First World War collected things from the battlefield and from the dead in patterns that repeat across national armies and that were observed and noted and never adequately explained by the military authorities who were aware of it. Buttons, insignia, identity documents, photographs taken from the bodies of enemy soldiers, personal items, letters, small devotional objects, photographs of families. These were taken not as trophies in any conventional martial sense, but as something else, something that the men who collected them were often unable to articulate when asked. The habit of collection was documented widely enough that it has to be understood as a response to something systematic rather than something individual. The collecting of enemy insignia and identification materials had a practical dimension, in that such materials had intelligence value. But the collecting that went beyond that, the photographs, the personal letters in languages the collector could not read, the small private objects that had meaning only to the man who had carried them, this was something different. Several medical officers and chaplains who observed and wrote about this habit suggested that it was a form of witness, that the men doing it were doing something in the face of the erasure of persons that the industrial war required. A refusal to let the dead be entirely anonymous even in death, even when the acknowledgement of their personhood was private and would never reach anyone who had known them. Whether that interpretation is correct is not determinable. The habit existed. The collections existed. Some of them survived the war. The food habits intersected with the medical realities of the trenches in ways that the home front was carefully not informed about. Trench foot, the condition caused by prolonged exposure of the feet to cold, wet conditions, was one of the most widespread medical problems of the Western Front and one of the most preventable. The Army knew how to prevent it. Dry socks, regular inspection of feet, rotation of men out of wet conditions on a schedule that did not allow prolonged exposure. The Army's official position was that these preventive measures were in place and that trench foot was a failure of individual soldiers to follow instructions. The reality, documented extensively in medical officers' diaries and in regimental histories, was that the conditions in the forward trenches made the prescribed preventive measures frequently impossible to implement. Socks could not be kept dry when the trench was flooded. Rotation schedules were suspended during operations. Foot inspections required the kind of sustained attention to individual soldiers that an officer managing 30 or 40 men under intermittent fire and constant fatigue could not reliably provide. The habit that formed around trench foot was therefore a habit of concealment. Men with trench foot who reported it were removed from their unit, sent to a casualty clearing station, possibly invalided further back. This was not always the outcome soldiers wanted. Leaving your unit meant leaving the men you depended on and who depended on you. It meant disrupting the social fabric that was the primary structure of survival in the trenches. Some men concealed trench foot until it was advanced enough that concealment was no longer possible. Medical records document amputations that would have been unnecessary if the condition had been reported earlier. The choice to conceal was rational within the logic of the trenches. It was irrational by any external standard. The two things were simultaneously true. The gas. After the first German chlorine gas attack at Ypres in April 1915, chemical warfare became a feature of the Western Front that both sides developed and deployed with increasing sophistication. The range of agents used expanded: chlorine, phosgene, chloropicrin, and most significantly mustard gas, introduced in 1917, which was not primarily a killing agent, but a casualty-producing agent, designed to incapacitate rather than kill, to burden the medical system and remove men from action for extended periods rather than remove them permanently. The habit that formed around gas was one of the most extensively documented behavioral changes of the entire war. The gas alarm, the warning system, the procedures for putting on the gas mask became automated reflexes drilled into men at training and reinforced by the consequences of failure. Men who survived gas attacks described the specific quality of fear that gas produced as different from the fear produced by artillery or machine gun fire. Artillery and machine guns were visible in their effects. You could see where they were coming from, could take cover, could calculate odds. Gas came on the wind. It came at night. It came in concentrations that were invisible until you were already in them. The fear of it was a fear with no defensive action attached, no calculation possible, only the speed with which you could get your mask on, and whether your mask was functioning properly. The gas mask itself became the subject of an entire set of habits and anxieties. Men checked their masks constantly. They slept with them, positioned for immediate access. They drilled the sequence of putting them on until the sequence was as automatic as any other motor reflex. And they distrusted their masks in ways that reflect a reasonable understanding of the actual reliability of early gas mask technology, which was imperfect, and which the men using it knew was imperfect. The official reassurances about mask effectiveness were not entirely believed by the men who were relying on them, and the diary records of gas attack survivors include a specific category of entry in which the writer describes wondering, as he put the mask on, whether this would be the time it failed. Mustard gas created its own category of psychological damage separate from its physical effects. Because it had a delayed action, because the symptoms of mustard gas exposure did not appear immediately, but hours after contact. Men who had been through a mustard gas bombardment could not know immediately whether they had been effectively exposed. The period of waiting, the hours before the symptoms that would tell you whether the mask had worked and whether you had been adequately protected, was documented by medical officers as one of the more psychologically damaging aspects of chemical warfare. Men who had been through it and were unharmed reported that the uncertainty, the waiting, the not knowing, had a quality that the immediate physical dangers of high explosive or machine gun fire did not have. It was a different kind of fear. A waiting kind. And it recurred because the next gas bombardment put you back in the same period of uncertainty. The relationship between the soldiers and the ground beneath them deserves its own extended examination because it was one of the most distinctive features of Western Front warfare, and one that shaped habits and perceptions in ways that have no real parallel in other military contexts. The Western Front was, in geological terms, a heavily engineered underground space. By the middle of the war, both sides had developed extensive tunnel systems beneath the trenches, some for communication and shelter, some as platforms for the mining operations that represented one of the most distinctive forms of combat in the war. Mining, the placement of explosive charges beneath enemy positions through tunnels dug below no man's land, was conducted by specialized units on both sides with a professionalism and a toll that the histories of the war have always slightly underemphasized. The miners who dug these tunnels worked in conditions that were extreme, even by the standards of a war not short of extreme conditions. They worked in darkness. They worked in silence because sound traveled through the earth, and the enemy's miners were listening, were digging their own tunnels. And the first indication that an enemy gallery was approaching was a change in the quality of the sounds you could hear through a listening device pressed against the tunnel wall. The habit that formed in the mining units was a habit of listening, of extended, sustained, hyper-focused auditory attention in total darkness, with the knowledge that what you were listening for, if you heard it too late, meant you were already dead. The large mines detonated beneath enemy positions could be heard and felt at enormous distances. The detonation at Messines in June 1917, which involved 19 large mines placed after 2 years of tunneling, was reportedly heard in London. The immediate physical effects on the men above the detonations were absolute. but the psychological effects on the men in the vicinity who survived, who felt the earth move beneath them in ways that the earth should not have moved, who heard the sound that no geological metaphor adequately captures, were documented by medical officers with a care that reflects how unusual and significant they found what they were seeing. Men who had been near large mine detonations showed neurological and psychological symptoms that the medical community of the time could not fully characterize because nothing in the medical literature prepared them for it. The relationship with the clergy and the formal religious institutions that were represented in the front lines through army chaplains was one of the more honestly documented aspects of the war in the letters and diaries of soldiers, and it documents a transformation in the relationship between men who had been raised in formal religious traditions and the beliefs those traditions were supposed to provide. This is not a story about men losing faith, though some did. It is a more complicated story about faith changing shape under conditions for which the theology of any of the participating nations' religions had provided no adequate preparation. The chaplains who served with frontline units occupy a complicated position in the historical record. Some of them were present in forward positions and conducted themselves with a courage and a practical usefulness that earned genuine respect in the accounts of men they served with. Others operated primarily in rear areas and had, in the accounts of enlisted men, a remoteness from the physical reality of the front that made their pastoral function feel hollow. The habit that formed in front-line soldiers in relation to formal religious observance was not primarily one of rejection. It was one of privatization. Men prayed. They prayed with frequency and intensity that would have surprised the secular observers of a later era. But they prayed privately, in whatever moment they had, in whatever language they had developed for talking to whatever they believed was there. And that language was increasingly disconnected from the formal theological vocabulary of the institutions that had formed them. The religious habit of the trenches was a habit of personal contract. Men made deals with what they prayed to. If I survive this, I will. It was bargaining theology, desperate and direct, with none of the liturgical structure that organized religion provides. And it existed alongside, without displacing, a parallel habit of superstition that was equally personal and equally undocumented in the official record. Lucky coins, specific items of clothing that had survived dangerous actions and were thereafter treated as talismans, routines that had coincided with survival and were repeated exactly. The superstitions were not considered superstitions by the men who practiced them. They were understood as a rational response to an environment in which the official probability calculations were clearly inadequate, in which something the rational mind could not account for had to be accounting for why some men survived and others did not. The wound culture of the trenches was one of the most persistently documented and least officially discussed aspects of the war. A wound that took you out of the line without killing you was understood, in the private language of the trenches, as a form of luck. The blighty wound, the term used in the British Army for an injury serious enough to require evacuation to England, but not so serious as to be permanently disabling, occupied a specific psychological space that official histories have always treated with some delicacy. Because to acknowledge the wound as luck was, to acknowledge that the alternative, staying in the trenches intact, was so bad that receiving a wound was preferable. That is what men were saying when they used the term approvingly. And they did use it approvingly in diaries and in letters and in conversation without apparent embarrassment. The institution of military service had produced a situation in which the men serving in it understood a wound as a gift. The medical records of casualty clearing stations document a category of wounds that military surgeons were trained to identify and that the official record handles with extreme care. Self-inflicted wounds, the deliberate wounding of oneself to obtain evacuation from the front lines. The official statistics on this are almost certainly underestimates because the medical officers who made these determinations were aware that a soldier found to have self-inflicted his wound faced court-martial and potentially severe punishment, and that a determination of self-infliction in a case where the evidence was ambiguous placed a significant moral and legal burden on the officer making it. The habit among medical officers in casualty clearing stations was therefore to resolve ambiguous cases in favor of the soldier. This was documented. It was noted as a policy by senior medical officers who understood its function. The formal structure of military law required punishment of self-infliction. The practical medical culture in the forward areas had developed a habit of not seeing what it did not want to see. The relationship between frontline soldiers and the staff officers who directed operations from headquarters behind the lines was one of the most consistently hostile themes in the private writings of men who served in the trenches, and the hostility was calibrated and specific in ways that reflect genuine knowledge rather than simple resentment. The soldiers in the trenches knew, because they were there, what the conditions were. They knew the state of the ground before an attack, whether the artillery preparation had actually cut the wire, whether the mud was passable, whether the planned objectives were achievable by the units assigned to them. They knew these things because they lived in the geography being theorized about in headquarters maps. And they were aware with painful clarity that the people making the operational decisions did not have access to the same information, were working from reports and aerial photographs and the filtered intelligence that came up through the chain of command with its own distortions at each level. The habit that formed was a specific and sophisticated skepticism toward official information about operations and objectives. Men who had participated in attacks that failed to achieve their stated objectives for reasons that were obvious to anyone who had actually been there developed a habit of reading official communiques and operational orders, with a parallel private assessment running alongside the official one. What the order said and what the order actually meant, what the objectives were and what the objectives were actually achievable. This habit of double reading, of maintaining a private assessment that diverged from the official version, was the trench soldiers' version of the same adaptation that had developed in their letters home. The official version existed. The real version existed. You kept track of both. The sounds of the Western Front are documented in the diaries with a specificity that makes clear how centrally the acoustic environment shaped experience and habit. The soundscape of the trenches was not simply loud. It was structured, and experienced men learned to read it. The difference between incoming and outgoing artillery, the specific sound of different calibers, the sound that a shell makes that is going to fall near you as opposed to the sound of one that will pass overhead. These distinctions mattered practically, and men developed the ability to make them quickly, reflexively, as an automatic processing function rather than a conscious assessment. The habit was the same kind of automated evaluation that the body develops for any environmental feature whose correct reading is reliably connected to survival. What the diaries also document, and what the medical literature of the period begins to engage with toward the end of the war, is the persistence of this automated auditory processing after the men had left the front. Veterans on leave described flinching at sounds in civilian environments that their nervous systems had correctly identified as acoustically similar to artillery, the slam of a door, the backfire of a motor vehicle, the sound of a crowd. The body had been trained, and the training did not switch off when the context changed. This was documented without the diagnostic framework that later generations would develop for understanding it. But what is being described in those diary entries and medical reports is legible as physiological and neurological adaptation. The body reorganized by sustained exposure to a particular environment in ways that persisted after the environment was gone. The question of what was knowable and what was officially unknowable runs through the entire archival record of the First World War in ways that are worth examining directly. The censorship systems employed by all the major combatant nations were not simply mechanisms for preventing useful information from reaching the enemy. They were also mechanisms for managing the information available to civilian populations about what the war was actually like. This was understood at the time by the people who designed and operated those systems. The decision about what to permit and what to suppress was a judgment about what the civilian population could process without losing its willingness to continue supporting the war. What was consistently suppressed or minimized was the physical reality of casualties on the scale being produced. The Battle of the Somme in 1916, on its first day, produced approximately 57,000 British casualties, of which nearly 20,000 were killed. The official communiqué issued that day described the attack as proceeding satisfactorily. The habit that formed in the journalism and official communication of the war was a language of sanitized abstraction, of advance and withdraw, of operations proceeding according to plan, of ground gained and objectives taken that existed in a different universe from the language being used in the diaries of the men who had actually been in the attack. Both sets of language existed simultaneously. Both were produced by people who knew what they were doing. The gap between them was not an accident. It was a managed feature of the information environment of the war. Toward the end of the war, as the casualty lists that newspapers were required to publish grew long enough that the abstracted language of official communiqué became increasingly difficult to sustain. Alongside the specific names in the casualty columns, the home front's ability to maintain the separation between the abstract and the specific began to deteriorate. Families who had received the same official telegram regret to inform you that more than once, whose neighborhoods contained houses behind whose closed curtains specific griefs were happening, began to develop their own version of the trench soldiers' double consciousness, the official version of the war that the newspapers and the government maintained, and the private version that was assembled from the silences in letters, from the things that men on leave would not talk about, from the specific nature of the wounds that the hospitals were receiving. The nurses who worked in the military hospitals documented what they saw with a precision that was in some cases remarkable and in some cases deliberately suppressed in the editing process that affected which wartime memoirs were published and which were not. The nurse Vera Brittain, whose memoir Testament of Youth was published in 1933 and remains one of the most significant accounts of the war from a civilian medical perspective, wrote with a specificity about wound conditions, about the physical appearance of men who had been gassed or burned or shrapnelled, that her editors softened and that she pushed back against softening because she understood that the softening was itself a form of the same management of information that had operated throughout the war. Her published account still contains descriptions that were considered too graphic by a significant portion of the reading public that encountered them, which indicates something about the distance between what the nurses actually saw and what the reading public had been prepared to expect. The industrial logic of the war was its most distinctive and most consistently under-examined feature. The First World War was not simply a war that used industrial technology. It was a war that applied industrial organizational logic to the problem of killing human beings, and that application produced results that were consistent with what industrial logic produces in any context, which is scale, efficiency measured by output rather than by any human dimension, and the progressive reduction of the individual unit to an interchangeable component of a system. The replacement system that kept frontline units at operational strength by filling casualties with newly trained men from the replacement depots was the clearest expression of this logic. Men died. New men arrived. The unit continued. The unit was the functional entity. The men who composed it were replaceable. The system did not say this. The system did not need to say it. The system demonstrated it continuously, through the speed with which the administrative paperwork processed the transition from casualty to replacement, through the way that new men were described in unit diaries as arriving to replace losses rather than as individuals joining a community, through the scheduling language of rotation and relief that treated men as components being cycled through a process. The habit of understanding oneself as interchangeable, as a unit of labor in a system that would continue after you were gone, was perhaps the deepest and most durable adaptation of the Western Front soldier. It appeared in diaries as a kind of acceptance, a flat statement that this was how things were, delivered without commentary. Men who were aware that they were in the third reconstitution of their unit, that the original men who had come over together in 1914 were almost entirely gone and had been replaced twice over, wrote about this awareness with a calm that reflects not indifference but a completed adjustment. You understood what you were. You were a soldier in an industrial war. The industrial war did not care about you as an individual. The industrial war cared about whether the position was held, whether the objective was taken, whether the line moved in the right direction or stayed where it was. You were in the service of that process, and the process would continue after you were no longer part of it. The armistice came on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918. It was negotiated in a railway carriage in a forest in France. The guns stopped. Soldiers on both sides described the silence that followed as the most disorienting experience of the entire war. More disorienting in some accounts than the worst of the fighting, because the fighting had its own terrible logic and the silence had none. Men did not know what to do with it. The habits of 4 years had no application to silence. The automated auditory processing had nothing to process. The constant calibration of risk and position and the reading of the ground and the sky and the sound had nothing to calibrate against. Men who had been in the trenches long enough walked out into the silence of the 11th of November 1918 and stood in it and did not know what it meant. The war had produced approximately 16 to 17 million dead, military and civilian combined. It had wounded approximately 20 million more. It had reshaped the political map of Europe and the Middle East in ways whose consequences are still unresolved. It had applied industrial methods to the management of human beings at a scale that had not been attempted before, and it had demonstrated, through 4 years of continuous operation, that those methods worked, that they could be sustained, that populations could be mobilized and maintained and depleted and replaced on a schedule that had more in common with factory production than with any previous understanding of what war was. The men who administered that system from positions of authority did not, in the aftermath, primarily describe what they had done as a failure. They described it as a lesson. They wrote reports. They drew conclusions. They developed doctrine. They prepared the next iteration. The soldiers who had lived through it came home and were largely silent about what they had lived through, not because they had nothing to say, but because the gap between what they had experienced and what their families and communities were prepared to hear was too large to bridge with language. The habits they had formed in the trenches, the sleeping habits and the eating habits and the habits of assessment and double consciousness and the management of fear and the reading of ground and the automated flinching at sound, all of it came home with them, invisible to anyone who had not been there, legible only to other men who had, and they lived with those habits inside civilian lives that had not been designed to accommodate them. The official commemorations began almost immediately. The monuments went up. The unknown soldiers were interred. The poppies were established as symbols. The language of sacrifice and honor and valor was applied to what had happened with a thoroughness and a speed that reflected how urgently the need for that language was felt by the nations that had produced the war. The gap between what was being commemorated and what had actually occurred was managed by the same mechanisms that had managed it during the war itself, by the careful selection of what to emphasize and what to set aside, by the preference for the abstract over the specific, by the elevation of outcome over process, by the maintenance, in public, of a version of events that the men who had been there knew and largely kept to themselves, was not the whole story. The diaries remained in drawers and attics and archive boxes. Some were published, carefully edited. Most were not. The men who had written them were not unwilling to be understood. They were unable to make themselves understood by people who had no framework for what they were describing. The war had created an experience that was genuinely outside the range of what the culture around it was prepared to receive, and the culture's response was to place that experience in a commemorative frame that honored it while not engaging with its content. The frame was beautiful. The frame was maintained diligently and with genuine emotion by people who had lost fathers and brothers and sons and husbands. The frame was not the thing inside it. The thing inside it was what the diaries recorded. The smell and the rats and the lice and the managed sleep and the letters written in 2 languages simultaneously and the dead used as landmarks, and the lucky wound and the silent firing squads and the paperwork that outlived the men it described, and the gas and the mining and the tunnels and the listening in the dark and the redistribution of a dead man's boots and the rum before the attack and the same as usual the morning after. The industrialized normalization of conditions that should not have been normalized, sustained for 4 years across a front that stretched from the English Channel to the Swiss border, administered by institutions that measured their success by metrics that had nothing to do with the cost in human beings of meeting them. The war ended. The institutions that had produced it continued. The men who had administered it retired or were promoted. The lessons that were drawn from it were primarily technical and doctrinal. The next war, which came 21 years later, applied those lessons on a larger scale. The diaries went into the drawers, the frame went up on the wall, and the distance between the two continued to exist, carefully maintained, officially invisible, recorded faithfully and precisely in the private documents of the people who had been there, available to anyone willing to read them without the frame in the way.